All right, welcome to another episode of Safer Communities Canada podcast, where we have critical, important conversations that gets into the complexities and the intricacies of the roots of violence, particularly from a community safety lens. We're very excited here to have an amazing guest, Dr. Felix Munger, who's doing some transformative work through the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities. So a quick bio, Dr. Felix Munger joined the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities in 2015 as the Executive Director, but comes with 25 years of experiences facilitating strategic planning, priority setting, and collaboration building with a wide range of participants and stakeholders, including equity deserving and Indigenous communities. Originally trained as a psychiatric nurse, which is very interesting. We haven't had a guest with that type of background. And he has experience in community safety, organizational collaboration, mental health and addiction, equity, diversity, inclusion, and organizational capacity development. Dr. Felix holds a master's degree in environmental studies from York University. Shout out to our neighbor, York, and a PhD in community psychology from Wilfrid Laurier University. Shout out, which is an institution I'm also at. Felix holds graduate faculty status, teaches in psychology and health sciences, and is a research fellow as the Weissman Center for Engagement and Research in Sustainability at Wilfrid Laurier University. Most recently, his work is focused on the impact of climate change on community safety, as well as evaluation and monitoring of community safety, something we're trying to be a part of and lead here at YAAACE as well. And lastly, Felix resides in Waterloo region in Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples. Thanks for coming here and for doing a drive from Waterloo to be in our studio in the Jane and Finch community.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so, how we came, for the listeners, how we came across the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities was really through our point of contact, Dr. Irvin Waller. And he mentioned the conference and some of the amazing work you're doing. And, on our end from YAAACE, I know Tamasha Grant was able to come to your conference. And it was really an honor to be part of the panel and connect with so many relevant stakeholders in the community safety space. So maybe we just start out. Can you tell us a little bit about the mandate and the type of work you are leading through the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities?
Yeah, happy to do so. And thanks for the introduction. If you're my age, it all sounds really good now. So it's kind of funny because, at my age, I've been able to do a lot of different things, which brings me then eventually to the point of being able to talk about how I actually got to this space and what I bring to it, I think. But the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities, formerly known as the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, until about a year ago. So you may actually hear me use the wrong acronym or the wrong name, still going back and forth in my head. It's taken me 8 years to really get familiar with it.
Bit of a transition.
And, so this transition is kind of funny now. Really, the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities was built by practitioners for practitioners about 20 years ago. So in a way, this organization is celebrating its 20th anniversary.
That's amazing.
And really what happened was there were lots of practitioners, many of which, by the way, read the Dr. Irvin Waller's book at that point in time. And they ended up working in a city where maybe a politician had heard Irvin Waller speak about crime prevention or had read about it, and somebody in the city suddenly thought, we should be doing more crime prevention work. And so what ended up happening quite often is the phone rang and somebody was told, starting next week, you are going to also do community safety work. At that point, we were talking crime prevention mostly. And many of them literally thought, I have no idea what it is that we're talking about here. And for over time, they found each other. That somebody from Halifax and somebody from Thunder Bay and Toronto and Waterloo region, Edmonton, Calgary. So you go across the country, Vancouver, Surrey, and I know I'm missing Regina, and a number of others. They ended up finding each other. And they started talking to each other. And they recognized the value of exchanging what they've been learning, what they've been trying, what they've been doing in their cities. And so that's still the foundation of this organization. It's really about bringing these practitioners, or bringing practitioners together, and into a community of practice that aims to kind of inspire local action at each of their specific spaces. It started with 14 members. Until about 2015, it was 14 members. We now represent over 150 communities across the country that come to this space that we're trying to provide at the core of what we're doing in our mandate, to help each other, to share with each other experiences, what they're doing. And really, I think it's important from a mandate perspective, which space do we have in safety? And I think it's important to clarify that from the beginning, that we're in this space, in this space around safety that extends beyond the criminal legal responses, and emphasizing preventative measures and multi-sectoral approaches, though, recognizing that these are very complex issues that need to be solved. They can't be solved by just one organization, be it the police or social services or health services or education service, but rather having them all come together and collectively address those. And in the work we do with communities, we've over the years built a kind of a technical support. It's where we help cities and smaller towns and regions and indigenous communities to do a local assessment, to identify priorities, and then help them in their efforts, evaluation and monitoring of the work.
Thank you for that. I mean, I really like the term in the new title for the organization, safer communities, because it speaks to how each community has its own local needs, and they're at a different trajectory in having to address different things that are the root causes. Maybe some of it is employment, some of it is lack of infrastructure, some of it is their concerns not being heard. So I kind of really like how you're able to work with different communities and cities and municipalities around supporting what is their needs, but helping them get there, because you're bringing, as you said, those practitioners, people with expertise, people with lived experiences. And that's where at YAAACE, we've really tried to build with you, because we're in a similar space, but I think at YAAACE, we focus more on, the community we're located, Jane and Finch, which has a historical root of being impacted by violence due to those risk factors intersecting. And so once we met Dr. Irvin Waller, we really tried to lock him in as much as we can. We're hoping to have him on the podcast, but he is part of a 10-member coalition we've created through the Center for Community Safety and Roots of Violence, and that's where we're continuing to build on our partnership. So I think we talked a bit around theory, and we work with people, but can you walk us through, like, when you think of January to December, don't tell me about the conference yet, because I want to dig a little bit deeper. When you work with a municipality, for example, or an initiative that you have, walk me through it from start to finish. What does that process look like, so readers really know, how do you go on this journey with people who want to make safer communities?
So there's different levels to which we support communities. So out of those 150 communities that we represent now, we don't work that closely with most of them. They maybe work internally and they share with each other and they learn from other communities. But there's a number of communities that come to us and ask us, can we help them? And it's based on UN system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlement. It's based on 20 years of work that we've done. It also our training encompasses this approach, and it's we would probably call it a grassroots, or at least more bottom-up approach, trying to do an identification of what a city needs and then moving forward. So the process, quite simple, is the idea of doing an assessment. It used to be called a safety diagnosis. We call it an assessment. And it's based on largely, and I think one of the questions we could talk a little bit about how we do this is on community engagement or consultations. We listen to community members, and one of the principles we have is we listen to those most vulnerable first. We do provide opportunities for people, for the general population, to provide some input, but we realize that it's really important for us to go to the people and listen to those that are most likely to be victimized from a safety perspective and a crime perspective. I can talk maybe later a little bit about how this looks like, but it's really important. And one of the reasons we do this, a colleague of mine who runs the European Forum on Urban Security, a similar organization to ours, she once said, and it really stuck with me, she said, those least likely to be vulnerable or experience crime are those that are loudest. Those that don't have the voice are most likely to experience any kind of form of crime and violence. And so this has always been shaping the way we approach this. So we go work with the city by having conversations with the people that live in the city, mostly those that are very vulnerable. We do often a survey. We look at existing data. Then we bring a steering committee of important stakeholders, those in education, enforcement, the city, social services, health service, addictions, homelessness services, education. We bring them together, create a steering committee, train them on how to best work collaboratively, how to make collaborative decisions, and then from there identify, based on what we found, what the priorities should look like, and then create a plan. And we help them then identify what kind of programs they could use, what are evidence-informed programs, what are evidence-based programs. We connect them with other people across the country to identify what they've learned implementing certain programs. And then we also often set them up with some structure, some form of a structure on monitoring and evaluating the work that they're doing. At the end of the day, what I'm describing is nothing different than a city's master transportation plan or master tourism plan or economic development plan. This is a master plan for or a strategy for a city that is aimed at safety. And it's different from a crime reduction plan that the police may have. It's an attempt to be more holistic and through this process identify risk factors and root causes of crime and violence.
No, thank you for that. I mean, thank you for walking us through that. But I think the how is so important, and using, as you said, evidence-based practices, trauma-informed lens, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. I think adding those pieces to the how makes a big difference, because we know in the past the how has failed many communities who are experiencing vulnerability, or people who belong to minoritized social identities who get a multitude of exposure to those risk factors. So one thing you guys have done really well, and it has become a leader and people respect, is this annual conference you host, where you bring together so many different stakeholders, community organizations, city reps, public safety worker, government workers. So walk me through that and tell us a little bit about maybe this year's conference happening towards the end of the year. I look forward to coming to it, to the West Coast. So tell us a bit about the conference and the thought behind it and what you hope to always get out of it.
Yeah, happy to. We've been doing conference. I know prior to me coming to the organization, those practitioners met. Or tried to meet on an annual basis. It became more formalized in 2015 when I joined. It has nothing to do with me directly, but it just at that point in time, it was a timing. It was a timing piece. The crime prevention really started. There were more and more people paying attention to crime prevention, and over the years we've had an annual conference, and they've been growing. They went from maybe 40 people to 60 people. We had a number of in-person, prior to COVID, in-person conferences. Started in Montreal. I think we were twice in Montreal. Then at some point in Winnipeg, we went to Calgary. We've been in Edmonton, Surrey, Vancouver. Had these spaces to run this national
Looks like
conference.
After this year, maybe Toronto next year.
Toronto, we tried a couple of years ago to do Toronto, and then COVID happened. Toronto would, of course, be a really, really interesting place to go.
We pledged to co-host it with you.
Okay, there we go. We take
on the record here.
It's on the record. We take the commitment. Then one of the things is, though, running a conference like this is a lot of work. And it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of cost, and it's a lot of risk at the same time. We were extremely successful. The last one was in Regina. We had over 160 people come to the conference. We've been seeing the steady increase, even though the 2 years before were online, where we had over 200 people easily, but we couldn't really offer the same. This year's conference is planned to be October 28th to 30th in Victoria, BC. So it's going to be absolutely stunning. We're still to some degree in negotiation and trying to figure out what the topic is. But a lot of it will be about what Victoria is doing at this point in time to showcase some of the innovative work that's happening there. One of the things in my job is I know nothing about any of the communities, but I know quite a bit about them. So in a way, I'm always stuck between. I know a little bit, but don't really understand them fully. And it's always amazing to see how much innovation happens in cities across this country. And so it'll be interesting to have people being exposed and to some degree being immersed into the experience, having this immersive experience into the work that is happening in the city of Victoria.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to hanging out in Victoria and really network with other folks and advance this work, because it's really, really important, and it's become a priority with a lot of the public safety concerns from these communities. So, I mean, reading your bio, it's very interesting. Like, I know we've had some coffee before, and I've got to personally know your story, but I think it'd be really great for the listeners. Tell us how you really came into this space from a lot of different spaces, and how maybe that unorthodox journey helps bring an innovative approach to how you look at the issue.
Well, maybe I'd like to think it's innovative. That'll be to be judged by other people later on. And I think there's really two ways of looking at it. One is this was always meant to be me ending up here, and everything before was a preparation to get here, or it's pure by chance. But it influences, of course, the way I think about it. In my bio, there is nothing criminology. There's no law enforcement in there at all. There's always been, certainly not criminology, there's always been, in all of the work that I've done, there's been an interaction with law enforcement. Not always, often okay, not always pleasant, let's put it this way. So as a psychiatric nurse, there was, as you can imagine, quite often when I was still working at a hospital, police enforcement would bring someone in. Then, of course, I worked in safe consumption sites, where I worked in a needle exchange in Toronto. So in addiction, so it's been quite a bit of these pieces. And then eventually I moved out of the space of doing one-on-one work. One of the reasons for that was recognizing that there's systemic challenges that people are experiencing. And in order to do meaningful work, it's perfectly fine and it's perfectly meaningful, but it wasn't my work to be a clinician, because it felt to some degree people coming in psychiatric nursing, coming into the hospital, and we do inside in this safe space, we try our best to get this person to be okay enough to go back out. But back out meant to go back into poverty, into abusive systems, into spaces where they constantly re-experiencing trauma into. So all these spaces, and I realized this, maybe this is my attempt of making this a better world, is by saying I want to go beyond making the world better for one individual, but actually trying to get into the policy work. So I ended up doing it. I mean, I did a number of things around addictions, mental health, and homelessness, including safe consumption site. I worked in needle exchange. I worked in a rehab as well in this space. And then I worked into more the policy work. So the community development. I was a community development officer with Toronto Public Health for a number of years. Then I worked in Scarborough for a number of years, developing addiction services in Scarborough, community-based addiction services in Scarborough. And then eventually ended up finding myself going back to school, did a master's first, worked for a short period of time again, and then ended up doing a PhD in community psychology. And after that, I had a call. So this is where chance happens. A colleague of mine who was running the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council, Christiana Sadler, she's done this work for 25 years, asked me to be on the Crime Prevention Council in Waterloo Region, where I live now. And I said yes. And through that, I started understanding. I remember the moment where she said, do you want to be on the Crime Prevention Council? And my response in my head was, isn't that a policing thing? Which is something we haven't really been able to talk about. But that's exactly the reason why we no longer have crime prevention in our name, why it's now Safer Communities, because it opens up the thinking of people, including my own, of being able to think about the social determinants of justice, these root causes and risk factors. Yeah, so that's how I ended up on the council. And then I had been doing a lot of mental health and addiction work after my PhD, and eventually took on a contract to work with what's now the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities, and that's how I ended up here. And a lot of it, if I want to think about this as a preparation, then a couple of pieces I bring to it. I bring a very strong commitment. Community psychology is very, very committed to marginalized communities, not just from a research, but also from an action perspective. That's always been important. I've worked with a lot of marginalized communities. That shapes the way I look at it. I don't come from a criminological background or even a justice background. I come from a human services, human health background into this. I bring to this a public health approach, I think.
Yes.
And through that, this is not meant as an offense to criminologists, but through that, a strong focus on prevention and the different forms of prevention. And that's always been really important to me in all of the work I've been doing. And I think that shapes to some degree how I look at this. But I'm surrounded by people who keep me on the ground. I'm surrounded by people that have studied, most of them have studied criminology, sociology, social or justice, the kinds of program that they went through. So they keep me on the ground, but I do bring a different perspective to some degree.
Yeah, and I think, I know in the past episodes we talked about the public health approach. It's so important, there's a lot of similar language, the social determinants of health, the social determinants of justice. We had Dr. Tanya Sharp, who talked about the social determinants of homicide. But really, they look at the root causes that make an issue ongoing. Because when we look at crime, when we look at safety, there's been cities who've been able to turn it around, right?
Glasgow.
Yeah. So, Dr. Irvin Waller talks about it. And so we do need some investment up front if we really want prevention to work. Yeah. You can't have wanting the results from prevention with little nippy small budgets that are not going to be long term, right? Because those seeds take some time to blossom, if we could use that analogy.
Cool.
So really, extending that public health approach versus this punitive approach, and just want to give some statistics we take the conversations to numbers. Like in any given jail, like the Ontario jails are operating at 113% capacity. We know at the Toronto South, the conditions are so bad that the judges are giving more time served due to how poor the conditions are there. And in any given day, in all facilities really in Canada, there's more people on remand than actually being sentenced, meaning they are innocent until proven guilty until their trial date. So we know this punitive measures hasn't worked. And when we think of the concerns in the last year or two and post-COVID, we need innovative approaches to doing this work. And, we talked about supporting the most vulnerable, whether that's a group, identities, or communities. So can you tell us a little bit around how does your approach to collaboration or consulting really differ when you're working with equity-deserving groups, whether that's Black communities, Indigenous communities, low-income communities? And what role, I'm adding a part 2 so you can kind of combine your answer, what role does data or really relevant KPIs, key performance indicators, what role does it play in being intentional and making sure the how is effective, or at least if it's not effective, you're able to target that and say, what do we need to do different?
Yeah. Let me start by giving you some answers around the working with vulnerable populations, but in the context of data, as much as reducing people's experience and their willingness to share their experience, and then
Yes.
calling it data is disrespectful to actually what people bring to the table. But the way we look at it is that we identify essentially what we take as information. So I'm going to stay with information here. This is existing information and data that we can find through Stats Canada, socioeconomic status, how many families are for example, live in under the poverty line. And then, of course, crime statistics from the police forces. We often use another set of data that's based on a survey that we've developed and any community can use. It's a community safety survey. And then the last piece is what I've talked a little bit earlier, is our way of listening to people and being very intentional to listen to people that are most likely to be victimized and most likely to experience harm in a city. We have this approach that, so first off, this is one of our principles. There's cities that say they want us to do public, have more of a public platform, town halls on this issue. But of course, we recognize, and you would know this, that people that are more vulnerable will not go to those because they may not feel safe. They may not have the capacity to go. They may have children to look after. So we essentially, when we do the consultations, we suggest that there's three groups. So local stakeholders, these are practitioners and service providers. And then the other ones are equity deserving groups and people with lived and living experience.
Very important.
And then other kinds of groups that we can imagine in the population. So equity deserving groups with lived experience, that's about prioritizing the voices of community members from those groups. And our idea is we go there. We find a way to be at the place. So we're not asking anyone to come to us.
Yeah, you go to them rather than they come to you, which is very different. It's never
a come to us, right? And then, of course, because we recognize that there is these levels of barriers for people to come and talk about it. And I'll talk. We have three options actually. The way when we do it, and this is what we train others that are doing these assessments and work on plans with the cities. They use this as well. And then, of course, we also we focus always consultation or engagement with Indigenous peoples, and there. For us, it's clear that we need to use culturally appropriate consultations. That's really essential to do this, about following local Indigenous engagement protocols and so on. And one of the things we learned, and this is an interesting story, I think, because we are a mainstream organization. I'm a white, middle class, Europe educated man with a lot of power and privilege. And at some point, early on, we were working with a community where we wanted to, we were reaching out to an existing organization from the LGBTQ plus community, and had this conversation. At that point, we were still called the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. And we suggested that we do a consultation, that we could go there, and if they could organize some people, and we do the consultation. And one of the staff members said, I don't think that's going to work out. I don't think you're going to get the information you want because of the level of privilege as a white male, and also you have crime in your name. They're going to think you're part of the system, the legal system.
The trust might not happen right away, right?
It won't happen. And it has in the past. It's actually never been a challenge for us, maybe because of my background in working in mental health and addiction. So it's never been an issue for me and for people to trust me because I know, because I think I have that level of confidence in it where the trust then develops with people. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is we said, well, okay, that makes a lot of sense. If you think that, then how about we partner? And as an organization, we pay your organization to do the consultations or these engagements on our behalf. And all we get from you is the information. that
because
you
they
would,
already have that relationship they can
already
leverage, and it's all about relationship. We know in this work.
That's exactly what it is. So we essentially, when we do work now, we say there's three forms of consultation. One is the city to town, or it's organizational led, where we do it or the city does it. And then there's another one where it's partner led. That's always an approach. When we want to talk to people in a homeless shelter, we go to the homeless shelter and said, we would like to have these conversations. And then they get to decide, are they going to lead us, or are they going to co-lead it with us? So are they going to organize it with their relationships that they already have, and then one of us is there, or are they completely co-leading it? Co-leading it, or are they completely leading it on their own?
I really like that. It reminds me of a leadership quote I once heard, which is, leadership is sometimes you leading and knowing when to step out of the way and let others lead. For the benefits of...
That's beautifully said for something we did more. We got to almost accidentally, because it was one of those learning experiences. But it's a perfect way of it's a perfect way of framing the way we try to engage with any community. Really, it's with any community group, and we recognize the power difference. That is really important. It's part of our training. We train when people come to us and want to get training on how to engage and how to understand what's happening at the local level, that we say there's moments where you need to recognize your power, your privilege that you bring as a city employee, even if you're not like me, white, male, middle class, highly educated. You are a city employee, and because of that, you have a power differential that may not play out the way you want it to play out.
No, thank you for that. I mean, we value relationships here at the YAAACE as well. Like, all of our case management programs are people from community, people from equity deserving groups, people with lived experiences of being impacted by violence and incarceration or other forms of trauma. Because, I mean, think about it. If you go to someone and says, okay, tell me about your life.
Yeah. That's right.
They're not willing to open up unless you have some sort of, they either respect you or they think you've had some sort of similar experience and you can relate to them. So to your point, the relationship piece is so important, especially when we're talking about folks who've been exposed to trauma or are in vulnerable circumstances.
Experienced harm,
I want to return to a bit of a question around the data piece. Just maybe, you work with so many entities from municipalities, cities, really across a range of geographies and groups. So what would be some data that is important to look at, or you've been able to look at? And I know Dr. Irvin Waller also speaks about this in the book. So, what were some examples, just so people kind of go, when we say data, what are exactly some things? If you're going into a shelter, you mentioned, like, what are some things you're looking to track or get a feel for to then help improvements happen?
So two things. In a shelter, we would probably be wanting to talk to people more around, to get information around their experience in the city, where they feel safe. Because one of the things we tend to forget in cities is that those more people with mental health challenges that are often also in shelters, they create a sense of lack of safety for other community members, but they're actually more likely to be victimized and experience harm. So this whole link between mental health and safety. So we would have these conversations. We would mostly, quite simple, ask, what are some of the places you feel safe? What are some of the places you don't feel safe? And what are some of the ideas that you have that you could bring to the city to make this space, a certain area, certain neighborhood, or the city as a whole safer?
Which is so important, because I think a lot of times people only think about data as numbers, but you're capturing their subjective experience in a place like a shelter, which we know many shelters people don't go simply because they don't feel safe, even if there is a shelter space available.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's always been important to us to balance Statistic Canada numbers and police numbers with the experience of people. We sometimes get a little bit of slack for that, but we make the argument we do triangulation.
Yes.
We use the more qualitative information the qualitative information that we get to inform the numbers that we have from police and Stats Canada. We look at any, and from a data perspective, if you ask me this question, we would look at any kind of information we could find, or any data we can find that relates to the root causes and risk factors. We know what the root causes and risk factors are. The criminologists have done a really good job, and so have the health scientists, to recognize what are at the root, what are there. So school engagement in schools for kids, school achievements, socioeconomic status, family environment. Are they experience violence in the homes, or do they have parents that are just not able to provide the kind of parenting that a kid at that age should have? If we were thinking about a shelter from a data perspective, we would look more at a city level. How many people have they had a homeless count? How many people did they capture? How many beds are available? How well are they used? What level of violence is happening in and around shelters? Those are the kind of data sets we're looking for, in addition to the information.
How they're staffed, what kind of resources they have. But they tell an important story around infrastructure, right?
Infrastructure. Yeah. We don't actually, in all fairness, that's a good point. I don't think we look at that sufficiently. Something else to look at. We keep growing the pieces that we think are necessary to understand the city, to holistically understand the city, what drives violence, what drives crime. But yeah, so something to think about. We do look at the availability of infrastructure, but not more closely at the infrastructure. How good is it?
Yeah.
Working in Toronto, the Needle Exchange, I've visited my fair share of shelters, and anyone here who's never been in a shelter, I highly recommend that you go visit one. Even if they're completely empty, just to get the experience, what it looks like, what these shelters look like.
I mean, I'm reminded of, there's a lot of people who are for shelters, but just not in their neighborhood, right? I mean, maybe walk us through that mindset. Like, what is your take on that, right? Like, they're like, I'm all for the shelter, but not in my neighborhood, because then they're worried crime is going to go up. My property values are going to go down. So how do we challenge that type of harmful rhetoric? That's a tough question.
It's one of the multi-million-dollar questions. It's one of the pieces. We keep working, we keep growing, we keep learning, we keep finding opportunities to position. This is one of the ones, the NIMBYism, we haven't really figured out yet a good way of doing this, but we continue to grow in this. For example, that it goes into the similar way of thinking. We are just finishing we call it the Guide to Ethically Speak and Write About Community Safety Issues. Where we're trying to help people understand that certain words or certain terms are problematic. Just to give you one example, the Canadian justice system, we no longer call it that, because it's not really a just system. We call it the Canadian legal system, because the system in itself isn't just. In fact, it can and does more often than any of us would like it to cause more harm as a system in itself.
Or you could have put an IN in the brackets before the justice. It could have been Canadian injustice.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we try to help people understand different ways of framing being a victim, being a perpetrator, being in prison, to use people who cause harm, people who experienced harm, without wanting to take away any of the experiences of victims. That's
the
not
people
the
first
point
language,
here.
right? Instead of referring to someone as an offender.
That's right. Somebody who is offended, because they're more than an offender.
Exactly.
They are a human being. And again, if we go back to the social determinants of justice, the root causes and risk factors, you and I know, we can put in front of us here 20 photos of different, or photos of 100 newborns. And I'd ask you, which one do you think? Because statistically, a good number of them will be in conflict with the law at some point or another. Point out which one. And you're going to be laughing and say, I can't. I need to understand what the experiences of these kids are while they're in early childhood and later on in their school
What
environment.
postal code they live in.
As simple as the postal code. Yes,
very important.
So then you can start making these predictions. So they have, so these kids don't grow up wanting to cause harm. Each one of those kids, but many of them, the boys potentially, are wanting to be firefighters or police officers. Or teachers, or not being in conflict with the law. So I think it's important to recognize this people's first language. They're human beings, but they're also offenders.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up so many good points. I think the language and naming, that's a form of advocacy that many organizations do, and YAAACE and your organization, that's as much as we do the work, behind the scenes is that advocacy piece around making others aware, like government folks, the stakeholders we work with, right? Yeah. And I mean, I remember being a university, and I came across this report for a paper I was writing. It was a United Way study called Poverty by Postal Code. And that really changed the way I looked at poverty and how I understood it. And then I remember reading the Halchansky report, which was more looking at, there's 3 cities within the city of Toronto.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was looking at the ones that are close to the subway and in higher socioeconomic status. The demographics are typically whiter, and therefore they have better access to opportunities, which means those folks living in that postal code are going to statistically be better off, or to go to careers that is going to help them. So it was really interesting. And I think all of these conversations come into fruition when you're doing community safety work, whether that's from a research or programming or service delivery side. So we got time for about 2 more questions. You do so many different things at the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities, which is what I love. And one of them is this pledge the cities kind of take. I know that the city of Toronto has committed to, taking a pledge. Can you tell us a little bit about that? To the extent...
It used to be that for cities to become part of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention in the early days, it was a commitment that was actually signed by the mayor.
Oh.
To move into that direction, a commitment to crime prevention. One of the things we found, this will be a longer conversation, because there is a lot of value to that. We eventually got rid of that because it became a hindrance for some communities to be able to join.
God, it kind of became a barrier.
A barrier,
so
really, and challenge, because the people that work in this space that want to be connected, then they can't go straight to the elected officials. They have to go through them, and the larger it is, it's a manager, another manager, director, and then the city manager or the CEO of the city, because it's really that's the place to go. And any of the steps up, somebody doesn't see it as something valuable, it gets completely undermined and doesn't happen. So these pledges are the way it used to be a pledge isn't quite the same anymore. And in all fairness, some of these pledges were made 20 years ago. Some mayors stick around that long, but it's quite possible that a number of mayors have no idea. They may not remember that they signed it 20 years ago, the letter of application, or it wasn't them and they don't actually know that their city is still part of this. So it ended up being less of a valuable piece. And with as a not-for-profit, our mission is to help cities become safer. And if that's the hindrance, then the board decided that wasn't going to be really providing the value we could provide to the cities.
And I love that because, it's a bit of you learn as you go. And at some point you had that introspective reflection and said, maybe we need to just change lanes a little bit. And to your point, you've really shifted to work with cities or organizations from the ground up, which is a totally different way. But of course, it always helps if you have the mayor on board.
It's always nice. And it's nice to see the Toronto mayor being so outspoken when it comes to gender-based violence or intimate partner violence.
Yeah, and advocate for actually the public health approach, which
that in itself. what happens now is with around the planning. So one of the things that I think that the willingness to go into a planning process and recognizing that safety is a high priority, and oftentimes what happens in our case is the idea of a community safety and wellbeing plan comes in some form or another in front of council, city council, and then city council decides. So I'll give you the example of Regina. The Regina City Council had heard about community safety and wellbeing planning in Ontario. They had some staff look into it. It got presented to City Council, and City Council decided that we are going to focus on this. And that's the pledge. The pledge is to create a plan. That's a first step of a plan, the first step of a pledge going into the right direction.
And that's so important to have a plan of action, because things can change, but at least you have a framework and a commitment. All right, so the last question I'm going to pose to you, and I want to bring it back to kind of action, or really how do we move forward? We're in this time capsule, and here we are, 2024. And, when you think about, many people assume we need simply more policing or harsher crime sentences to make cities safer. We know a great example is the USA, and that hasn't worked, even though they have the highest incarceration rate in the world. So when you think about the social determinants of health, what would be 3 things you think, whether governments or cities or municipalities, given your experience with the organization, what are 3 things we can invest more of as action item things? And whether that's large or it's really micro, like things you can do in the community. Outside of our justice institutions, what are some things you think we can do better that can drive the outcome of safer communities?
I wish you had asked me what are the 100 things we could do, because that's the problem. There is so many of those, right?
Very good.
And it's always, but actually it gives me an opportunity to speak a little bit about the whole notion of this process. Every city has different root causes and risk factors that often drive crime and violence and have an influence on safety. A good amount of those are overlapping across Canada, even across the globe. So there's certain pieces that have an overlap that drive that. Smallish things, in my opinion, would be to think about but focus on the children today. So for across the country to implement, to support what schools actually could do other than academic achievement, to recognize that if the system were to actually support children that are struggling in school for a number of different reasons, be it learning disabilities, being their home, be it because they don't actually have enough food, their experiences in their neighborhoods, to really support them, because this is a really great space to start with. There is programs like Stop Now and Plan, SNAP, that have incredible outcomes. There is programs like the Triple P that was developed in London, Ontario, there's programs like Triple P, which is positive parenting program. There's other ones. The 4th R is the one I was going for in London. So to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and relationships, and some of the outcomes of the early studies in terms of bullying and violence in schools is just outstanding. There is so much we could do if we were to, as a society, invest in children more so. To, as many of my colleagues talk about, turning off the tap. Because these are the children that are right now in this school that we're having this conversation in. There is children in this school already, in this system, that the teachers and the social workers already know there's a good chance that they'll be in conflict with the law. It's not that hard to figure this out, and it shouldn't be that hard to meet them where they are now and support those children. But the infrastructure isn't, in my opinion, the infrastructure isn't there sufficiently.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of this analogy I was listening to a podcast that someone said, when you identify those people or the people who are exposed to those risk factors, it's kind of like they're on this highway going down this negative path. And to your point that there can be 100 solutions, we're trying to get them to exit at one of the upcoming exits.
Yes.
Now, one of them might be through school.
Yeah.
One of them might be through sports and connecting with a caring adult. One of them might be by building a playground in the community where kids can gather and play. One of them might be having cleaner and better conditions in a housing building. So I think to your point, if you add up all the pennies or all the little things, it makes the community safer. And so...
and it provides these opportunities for us to intervene. One of my favorite stories is from McCluskey, Karen McCluskey from Glasgow. We had her at a conference, and she was telling this story, and Glasgow as the murder capital of Europe. And she was telling this story about this one kid. So she said, we wanted to understand what's happening. And she told a story of a kid and how he got to eventually stabbing someone and going to prison. And then as part of trying to figure out what happened, they went back and talked to the teachers. They talked to people that were engaging. And every single one of them said they already had red flags, but the system wasn't equipped to help that kid to provide the exit on that highway. But they all saw this kid was on the highway. There would have been opportunities, and it just wasn't, the systems weren't working to pick this kid, to help this kid get off the highway.
Which speaks to early diagnosis and early intentional prevention, and also when needed, timely intervention or a culturally reflective intervention.
I'm going to give you, so this is my number one. My number two, you asked me for three, I'm only going to give you two. I think there's lots of opportunities to work with people, like the kind of work you do with the violence interrupters, too, because I recognize every city has needs for some of the immediate things.
Yeah.
So I always like to challenge a city to say, what do you need to do immediately to make your city safer? But what are you going to do to avoid, to turning off the tap, to avoiding that the current generation of young kids are going to be ending up the ones you have to deal with at this point in time? Because only that is, to me, not only that, but that to me is prevention. It's about trying to think upstream, look upstream, and intervene further up.
Well, thank you. I'm going to end off with a quick curveball question.
Curveball question.
Yeah, the curveball question is, what is one advice you would give to the 15-year-old Felix who's not a doctor yet and is trying to figure out life? Now, what advice would you give your old self?
I'm not even sure I would give my old self the advice to eventually get a PhD. I came really late to this. What would I... That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about this for a really long time. There's so much in this that one of the reasons I live in a different country now for a long time, I have a number of different pieces of education. I think a lot of that was the right thing to do. Part of me sometimes thinks I should have stayed a little bit longer in clinical work and to get a better understanding of trauma. We didn't, when I was trained, we didn't talk as much about trauma and the impact
a deeper
of trauma.
dive.
A deeper dive into the human aspect of the work. And I did it for a long time, but something like a needle exchange, it's very transactional. It's way more transactional than it's about clinical. And so maybe this will be an area that I would just to give myself a more round perspective to understanding the human experience and the human experience or the experience of human beings on how they end up where they are now. Oftentimes to no fault, not really a fault on their own, just because of the circumstances.
Well, thank you so much for the rich conversation. I think we covered quite a bit of ground, but above all, we're always trying to push our imagination in thinking about innovative solutions to community safety issues, which, as we talked about, you can start out in so many places, but the main thing is maybe wherever you are as listeners, plant yourself and make your impact in your own local community. And if we all do the little things, it adds up, while in the process we advocate for the bigger piece, such as the language, like naming the problem, valuing lived experiences and emotions, and trying to create the environment for the systemic reform to be more equitable, to benefit everybody in that space and within that community. So thanks a lot. Thanks for coming in, and thanks to the listeners for another episode of Safer Communities Canada. Until next time.